Hello, everyone. This is the 277th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back American author, journalist, and journalism professor, Mr. Clemente Lisi, as we discuss the USA national team during the years 2000 to 2010. Mr. Lisi has appeared previously on a podcast discussing various World Cups. Mr. Lisi is a journalism professor at the King's College. He has been a journalist for the likes of New York Post and the New York Daily News, and he has also worked as a senior editor for abcnews.com and is also a contributor to Religion Unplugged. Mr. Lisi is also the author of the books The U.S. Women's Soccer Team, An American Success Story, and his new book, The World Cup, a history of the planet's biggest sporting event. This is an update to his book from 4 years ago. And finally, Mr. Lisi is also on Substack at Planet Soccer. Welcome, Clemente.
Hey, great to be back. Thank you.
Let's discuss the US national team history. So, can you paint a picture of the US soccer landscape internationally and domestically with the young MLS league as we enter the millennium?
Yeah, as the new millennium approached, soccer in the US occupied what I would call a fragile but promising position. So domestically, Major League Soccer was only a few years old after starting in 1996 as a result of the 94 World Cup, but still trying to stabilize itself financially and culturally. We should point out that the Miami Fusion and the Tampa Bay Mutiny both contracted after the 2001 season, a sign that the league was still in a very fragile state. Internationally, the U.S. men's national team, I would say, had reestablished itself after decades of absence, 40 years off the World Cup until 1990, but they qualified in 90, 94 as host, 98 again, but had not yet been considered a consistent competitor. I think the foundation was there, but the sport still sat outside the mainstream of baseball, football, basketball, hockey for sure.
The 1994 World Cup in America would have been a somewhat distant memory at this point, and things had returned to a norm. Was there any visible impact that the World Cup would have had on the game here at that point?
I think the important thing to know about the 94 World Cup is that it established a structural legacy and sort of a chance for US soccer to build from within. But I would say there was no immediate cultural explosion. But it led directly to the creation of MLS, as I mentioned, improvements in infrastructure, youth development, federation organization. These things were all lacking before 94. However, by the late 90s, much of the casual buzz, I would say, of the World Cup had faded away. Attendance had normalized. I think the World Cup's true impact would be more long term, something maybe we're seeing now with the start of another World Cup on US soil, but 30 years later. So in those 5, 6 years afterwards, it wasn't quite evident yet, I would say.
In terms of coverage, MLS may have had some scant coverage on ESPN and other cable channels, while the national team matches were still on ABC, I believe. As far as print, there's still Soccer America magazine. There was some minimal but growing coverage of the European leagues, primarily the English Premier League, on some cable channels. Now, as little as it may have looked at the time, was this nevertheless an important change?
Yeah, even though you mentioned the limited coverage on ESPN, ABC, and then you mentioned magazines like Soccer America, I would also mention Soccer Digest magazine, which I wrote for in that period in the 2000s. They represented a meaningful foothold. I mean, the gradual introduction of European club games on cable like Champions League and also the Premier League, I think was the beginning of this growing appetite Americans had for the global game. It seemed modest at the time, but I think it marked the beginning of a broader media ecosystem for soccer in the US. And it was an incremental exposure at this time that helped cultivate, I would say, a more engaged fan base that I think would explode a few years later, maybe a decade later, with the start of the internet and the ability to stream games live. But this was born here in the 2000s.
At this point, what was the place of the 1990 and the 1994 US soccer pioneers in the American game?
Yeah, I would say the players from 1990 and then 94, they served as a sort of cultural and professional bridge. So by this time, by the year 2000, many had already transitioned to coaching, administration, mentorship roles within MLS and US soccer. Their experiences helped shape the early league and the national team expectations. For example, players like in 2009, Peter Vermees would become the coach of the Kansas City Wizards, and he would be coach until 2025. Alexi Lalas would become GM of the Los Angeles Galaxy and would help bring in David Beckham and later became a broadcaster. He is one now. There are other examples. Tab Ramos would become a coach. Hugo Perez would become a coach. So these players were really, I think, influential early on. They had come back from Europe, helped establish MLS, and then by the 2000s, they were retired, but they were involved with the game still. And that was important because for the first time, you had this first generation that played the game for the first time at a high level in 40 years, and now they were giving back.
Bruce Arena had taken over as the US national team manager following the 1998 World Cup. What had been his trajectory and how had he changed the team's tactics and mentality by this point?
Yeah, Bruce Arena came in, I would say, with a very strong track record as a college coach and early MLS success with DC United, which really established that first dynasty in the late 90s. Look, I think he brought something that US soccer didn't have before, tactical pragmatism, emphasized organization, defensive discipline, team cohesion. I think mentally, he started to instill this belief in the US players they can compete with any top team in the world, which I think leads to the evolution of the US identity later in that decade. I think the leadership that he brought marked a shift toward confidence. He would coach the US from 98 to 2006. That includes two World Cups. And I think he, in that process, became arguably the best US manager that the US had in the modern era for sure.
Following the failure at the 1998 World Cup, you mentioned in our 1998 World Cup podcast that there would be a more concerted effort by MLS clubs to develop American players. Can you expand on that?
The role of MLS in American culture is funny. Is MLS there to help grow the idea of club soccer in America, or is it there to develop players? I think the initial idea was to develop domestic players. And I think after 98, the disaster of 98, the World Cup, where they finished 32nd out of 32 teams, MLS clubs began investing more seriously in domestic players. There was this growing realization that relying on the college pipeline was insufficient. So we have the beginning of youth academies, like we see in Spain and the Netherlands, like with the Ajax and Barcelona. Structured development pathways started to take shape, though still in early form. I'd say at the same time, you had the launch of Project 2010, which was a blueprint first conceived in 1998, and the aim was to create a more competitive US team by the 2010 World Cup. And we'll get there, of course, to 2010. But the idea was to grow the national team into a more competitive force over the decade. And I think they were able to accomplish that.
At this point, late 90s, early 2000s, there's also more of an American representation in the European leagues, such as Brad Friedel at Liverpool, though he had some work permit issues, I believe, there, Claudio Reyna in Scotland, Frankie Hayduk, Tony Sane, Jovan Kirovsky in the German Bundesliga. There was also the rarity of a very young American prospect, Landon Donovan in the Bundesliga. Was that a visible change and progress from the previous decade?
It was a visible change. You mentioned a lot of really great players from that decade. The increased presence of Americans in Europe was a clear sign of progress. That had already begun in the mid 90s with Lawless going to Serie A, that kind of thing. But players started gaining experience abroad and they brought back this higher tactical awareness, professionalism to the national team that we never saw before in the US. This players like John O'Brien are totally forgotten, but he played at Ajax and was really the first American to play in what is now the Champions League. Later on, you had Clint Dempsey at Fulham. They stand out. We forget, because we live at a time now where the US is not producing the goalkeepers that we used to produce. But at that time, we were really known for our goalkeepers, Brad Friedel, Casey Keller. They become stars in the Premier League and they would go on to compete for the starting job in that decade for the national team. The emergence of young prospects, like you mentioned, Landon Donovan, they symbolized this new ambition, this potential that we never saw before. And I say compared to the previous decade, it reflected a much broader and more credible international footprint that I think you never saw before by Americans.
The USA qualified for the 2002 World Cup. The tail end of the process coincided with 9/11. How did this affect the soccer vis-a-vis security going forward, especially at the 2002 World Cup?
Yeah, the events of 9/11, I think, added a profound emotional layer to the qualification process. As you mentioned, security became more heightened globally, including at the World Cup in 2002, where the US did reach the quarterfinals. I think for the US team, it did create a sense of unity and purpose. I think if you talk to players today, every time there's a 9/11 anniversary, there have been stories over the years of American players talking about that time. And I think the broader soccer world became more conscious of logistics and safety in international tournaments. But at the same time, I think the US felt patriotic, like an identity, kind of like the ice hockey team during the Cold War. I think this created a sense of unity that we never saw before on the national team. I think that carried with them throughout that decade for sure.
The USA performance in the 2002 World Cup itself was beyond expectations as Portugal and Mexico were defeated as the team reached the quarterfinal, its best performance in the modern era, with Brad Friedel in superb form in goal. I remember he saved a penalty against South Korea and was just impressive throughout. Can you walk us through the impact of this World Cup and the aftermath for American soccer?
Yeah, 2002 performance by the US team, I think, gave the US soccer a lot of credibility. Despite the fact these games were on in the middle of the night in the United States, I think a lot of people consider this World Cup to be really the moment that Americans embraced the World Cup. I have a different theory about that. I think 2010 is more that period because of the time zone difference. But I agree, the victories over Portugal were stunning. The fact that they got to play Mexico in a game that was a knockout game at the World Cup, got to the quarterfinals. We still dream about, American fans still talk about that quarterfinal as the standard to reach a quarterfinal. I think it demonstrated the US could compete at a high level. And that was a World Cup where we saw teams like Turkey and South Korea also do well. So it was an anomalous World Cup in that sense. But I think in the aftermath, I think it definitely boosted player visibility, particularly for the players who were looking to move abroad. Domestically, I think it reignited interest and validated the development progress that had been started in 94 with the World Cup. And I think the payoff was quick. I think it creates a false sense maybe that things were in a better shape than they were. We would see then that the US team wouldn't do better in 2006. And like I said, we're still elusively chasing that quarterfinal to this day.
Did the USA have a new status after the 2002 World Cup? And how important was it to maintain the manager Bruce Arena into the next 2006 World Cup cycle? Was continuity a sign of improvement in itself?
Yeah, I think after that World Cup, the US, like I mentioned earlier, did gain respect as this dangerous and potentially organized opponent. The idea that Americans don't play soccer anymore, I think that was starting to fade away. At this time, we are also becoming much more competitive, maybe even better than Mexico. And I think, yeah, keeping Bruce Arena ensured stability, continuity during really a crucial growth phase, and also signaled that the Federation valued long-term planning over these reactive changes where you would change coach every 2 years. I think this helps sustain progress going to the next World Cup cycle for sure.
How important was regularly participating in the Gold Cup and tournaments like the 2003 Confederations Cup in the growth of a team?
Yeah, I think regular participation in tournaments like the Gold Cup, I think create more competition and you have players that are competing at a high level. Confederations Cup, we forget that tournament is long gone now, but that offered exposure to elite opposition that was better than friendlies and better than the US Cup that was played in the 90s, right? I think these competitions helped players gain experience in high pressure environments. The group stage of those tournaments sort of mimicked the group stage of a World Cup, so you would sort of get the ebb and flow of playing three games and trying to advance to the knockouts. They were essential stepping stones toward this global competitiveness. In the 90s, that was dominated by tournaments and like the US Cup friendlies. Those were used to give player exposure. But I think in the early 2000s, it would transform into something much more professional. For example, the US would go in the six Gold Cups played between 2000 and 2010, the US would win three times. So this idea that Mexico was the regional power that was starting to fade away here as well.
In 2004, MLS is in the national news with the signing of a 14-year-old Freddie Adu. How did this impact the league and coverage of soccer in general?
We look at Freddie Adu's career now and we see it as ultimately maybe not what it could have been, but Freddie Adu's signing at age 14 have brought unprecedented media attention to MLS. And we should point out that at the time, Freddie Adu's family was being courted by Inter Milan. So he could have easily have gone to Europe and been forgotten like so many other players do, right? But I think it symbolized the league's willingness to invest in youth and marketability. I remember at the time there were a lot of ads, both print and television, with Freddie Adu and Pele together. So it was kind of this legacy, I think. However, the expectations I think were arguably unrealistic given his age. I mean, a lot of 14-year-olds look really good, and then when they play, things evaporate. Adu would go on to have a journeyman career. He would bounce around many teams, but some of his contemporaries, I would point out to Josie Altidore, Michael Bradley, they would go on to have very impactful U.S. careers. And I think that's something not to underestimate the fact that players of that same generation were breaking through. I think Adu got a lot of the marketing dollars around him, but at the same time, there were other players that would go on to really symbolize that team as the decade wore on.
And I guess it must have been a novelty to have such a young American talent, especially at that age.
Yeah, and not only that, yeah, and then you're able to grab headlines that way. And we see that today, when a 16-year-old debuts for Arsenal in the Champions League, that becomes the headline, even if Arsenal were to lose 2-1, let's say, because it is young, even for Europe. But it was the beginning of this idea that you don't need to go to college in the US to play soccer. And that was sort of a big break too. So that created a template. And we see that today all the time. There's 15, 16-year-olds playing in MLS every year now. And yeah, it kind of shows up in your Twitter feed, but it goes away like the next day because it's not a big deal anymore. But at the time, you're right, it was a novelty.
The United States once again qualified to the World Cup, the 2006 edition in Germany, with Bruce Arena still in charge. By now, was an American qualification regarded as a given in the region?
Yeah, I think this cycle, especially U.S. qualification from CONCACAF was expected, which is a good sign because, as we know, for 40 years, that was not the case. I would say that at this point, the U.S., in the middle of the decade, the U.S. had established itself as one of the region's strongest teams, if not the strongest, along with Mexico. And while not guaranteed, I would say failure to qualify would have been seen as a major setback at the time. So this reflected the growing standards. And like I say again, no longer was Mexico the team Americans feared. And I think that's a huge mental break at this point for the US. The fact that they're able to say, you know what, we are the best team in our region, and maybe we can be a team that gets out of the group at the World Cup every time. And that's a change of mentality that happened gradually, but it happened so gradually that I think we have to reflect back to say that's a huge difference from where we were in 1990 or even 94.
For the 2006 World Cup cycle, there's stability with the likes of Claudio Reyna, Landon Donovan, Pablo Maestroni, John O'Brien, Steve Cherundolo, Eddie Lewis, Berhalter, Wolf, DeMarcus Beasley, McBride, Eddie Pope, and not forgetting the eternal Casey Keller. Was this an important development as well?
Yeah, I think this continuity of key players. I mean, with the same coach, now you're getting the same key players. You have cohesion, you have experience, and having these players together for multiple cycles, that helps strengthen chemistry. It creates stability. We see this with all the major national teams with Brazil, Argentina, Italy, Germany. Like this is a normal thing. It's a sign of the maturing soccer program. And I think it allowed for a clearer tactical identity, a leadership structure. Now, if you bring in younger players, you have the veteran players that can, help guide the younger players. I do agree. I think the players that really stood out for me in this period was Altidore, Bradley, Claudio Reyna, Landon Donovan, Eddie Pope. Like these were the players I think formed the core. And you would have players come in over that decade, but I think having that core, you would really see the difference by the time they got to 2010, for example, at that World Cup.
The new players in this cycle included Tim Howard, Carlos Bocanegra, and Clint Dempsey. From cycle to cycle, were players in better quality due to the development at MLS followed by transfer to Europe?
Yeah, I will highlight two players you mentioned, emergence of Tim Howard and Clint Dempsey, I think indicated this improved development pathway. MLS was beginning to serve now as a launching pad for players to play 2, 3 seasons, then go to Europe. These players often arrived better prepared technically and mentally. I think it marked a clear progression from the earlier generation. And like I mentioned, Howard and Dempsey are really prime examples. They were both playing in the Premier League, and by 2010, they were full-blown national team stars.
In contrast to 2002, this 2006 World Cup was disappointing as the team were eliminated and the Bruce Arena era was over after 8 years. Why do you think the team failed despite being a stronger team on paper?
Yeah, I think despite the strong expectations, I think tactically and physically the team struggled, and there was perhaps an over reliance on the 2002 squad, though I don't blame Bruce Arena for doing that. And you have to adapt to an evolving competition. So there were injuries, form issues played a role. I think ultimately the gap between expectation and execution that proved costly. But I will point out there were some highlights in that World Cup. 1-1 draw with Italy in the group stage, I think, proved the US could play at a high level, and we did get that now iconic photo of Brian McBride, bloody nose. But I think being consistent would be key heading to 2010. And I think we would see that in the latter part of the decade.
Despite ending in disappointment, how important was Bruce Arena's stewardship in the growth and improvement of the national team program?
Yeah, I can't say anything but really good things about Bruce Arena and especially his tenure. I mean, I think it was foundational, helped modernize US soccer. He delivered results while building belief. This idea that you can beat anybody. His influence, I think, extended beyond tactics into culture. And I think by 2006, even though that was a disappointment, his impact remained overwhelmingly positive. For example, I would say the period between 1998 and 2006, which he coached the US team, I would call that almost a golden era for the US national team. And I think under Arena, the US achieved, I mean, let's look at the statistics. Its best World Cup result in 72 years by reaching the quarterfinals. They defeat Portugal in the group stage, Mexico in the round of 16 during his first tenure, because let's not forget he did coach the US team again a little bit later on, decades later, but he compiled 75 wins, which is the most in US men's soccer team history, led the US to 3 Gold Cups. I mean, I think he developed the blueprint for successfully integrating MLS players and European players into the same team. This is a first for any manager on the at this level. So I do think that he creates a template for future success.
Following 2006, there's a new manager, Bob Bradley. What can you say about him and how he changed things around while continuing the trajectory already set in the USA soccer program?
Yeah, Bob Bradley is in a lot of ways like Bruce Arena, but just a tougher. He brought more discipline, strong work ethic. He really believed in playing the best players. He never played favorites. He emphasized fitness, accountability. I think those are good things to have at the national team level. But he was less charismatic with the media. I know that's for sure. But I think he maintained his continuity in competitive standards, and that's important. I think that his tenure helped transition the U.S. into this next phase. So getting rid of Arena at that point, I think, was a smart idea. I think he helped establish this team identity that we identify the U.S. with now, which is gritty, never say die spirit that would come, I think, to become the U.S. trademark in the coming years. I think that would start in 2010. And we still have this, the U.S. identity still is this, hey, if they're down 1-0, they can always score in stoppage time to tie the game, that kind of attitude.
In his first year in charge in 2007, I was always surprised that he used the best United States team, the A team, for the Gold Cup, while using a mostly reserve side for the more prestigious Copa America. How was this decision regarded as a whole?
At the time, it was controversial, but I think looking back in hindsight, it was very smart because by prioritizing the Gold Cup, that would secure Confederations Cup qualification. That tournament was at the time considered elite tournament. If you won that tournament, it was a FIFA trophy. It was a big deal. Playing in the Copa America was good for experience, but ultimately the US was never going to win the Copa America. And getting even to the semifinals or quarterfinals of Copa America would have been nice, but it wouldn't have meant anything. It wouldn't have given them the platform. So I think at the time, it was very pragmatic. I think it reflected this management idea over this lack of ambition. In hindsight, I'd say the result justified the approach. But I think you're right. At the time, it was like, why are we doing this? It's funny because I think if the US had the chance to do this today, I think the US would probably prioritize Copa America because it's a much bigger platform. At the time, I can see how you'd be torn.
In 2007, there's a major shift in the MLS as English superstar David Beckham joins the league with much fanfare, bringing with it the Beckham rule in the league. What was the significance of his arrival regarding the coverage of the league and the showbiz aspect of it?
Yeah, we should point out the Beckham rule allowed teams to sign marquee players beyond the salary cap. So teams are hampered by the salary cap, unlike teams all over the world, but introduced a stronger entertainment global brand element to the league that they never had before. I think this was a turning point for MLS, this commercial evolution. I think ultimately just they increased MLS visibility and credibility on a global scale. And a little bit like Pele in 1975 in the NASL, this would usher in, and there had been other global superstars before, but now you had more and more players potentially coming afterwards. And I always say, without David Beckham and the ability to sign him and have him play for the Galaxy and win trophies and also have a stake in a future franchise, I mean, by allowing that at the time, we have Messi today. That would not have happened. That evolution would not have happened. Messi might never come to an Inter Miami team that is part owned by Beckham. So a lot of the seeds of the success that we see today and the visibility started here in 2007.
And of course, it was part of the news, and not just sports news, his arrival.
Sure. It was beyond a sports story. Everyone knew who David Beckham was prior to his arrival. And yeah, for the first time, people were buying Galaxy jerseys and wearing them. And it was this sort of cool thing. We see that all the time now today with Messi and Ronaldo whenever they go somewhere. But I agree, that was the market shift. And I think that's a key thing. And without Beckham coming, I don't know that I think we would have gotten to where we are today, but it would have taken a little bit longer.
Leaving aside the Gold Cup, that is a regional tournament, the closest the United States came to winning a major title was in the 2009 Confederations Cup by reaching the final, well, losing to Brazil, but eliminating the great Spain side of that era. How significant was this achievement at the time?
Yeah, reaching the final, losing, that was a disappointment. But for the US, you're right. Defeating Spain en route to that final was tremendous. I think it remains one of the biggest achievements in US soccer history. But it proved that the team could compete with the world's best teams, not just because they said they could, but because they actually could in games that mattered. I can't overemphasize enough that the Confederations Cup at this time was a big deal. Teams would send their best players. It wasn't like considered a B tournament. It was considered a big deal. And I think the performance enhanced the global respect and confidence in the US. And I think it reinforced the progress that had been made over the decade. Because now by 2009, we're at the end of the decade. And I think by then you really saw the fact that this evolution that, maybe they can do something in 2010 at the World Cup a year later.
As expected, Bradley and the United States qualified for the 2010 World Cup with veterans such as Tim Howard, Bocanegra, Oguchi Onayobu, Steve Cherundolo, Clint Dempsey, and Landon Donovan still part of the mix. At this point, there are many more foreign-based players along with the experience. So as we come to the end of this decade, does United States enter the World Cups with different ambitions?
Yeah, I think by 2010, the expectation had gone from risen beyond just we're happy to be there. The goal is we have to get out of the group, which is funny because that's still the goal of every World Cup for the US. We have to get out of the group. But at this time, going into 2010, this was the idea. And you mentioned a mix of veterans and European, MLS veterans, European-based players. I think this is when we start seeing this evolution of more Americans are going to Europe and the idea that maybe MLS players are secondary. This is something that we see a decade later when Klinsmann takes over, this idea that maybe the European players are better, but I did think you had a stronger roster, a bigger pool. I think the team aimed not just to advance out of the group, but potentially maybe go deep because the Confederations Cup had given that idea that we could, if we can beat Spain, we could beat anybody, right? And I think this reflected this shift in mindset, which is very important. At the eve of the 2010 World Cup, I'm still reminded of, England was in this group and England was supposed to win the group. And I remember the famous London Sun headline, right? It was easy. England, Algeria, Slovenia, Yanks, right? That was the headline. But as we would see, it wasn't so easy for England, and the US would really be the star team of that group.
The performance in this World Cup was an upgrade to the 2006 performance, but the United States were eliminated in the second round and did not reach the quarters, as that would have been the aim, I imagine. What was the general takeaway?
Yeah, winning the quarters is always the aim, right? Getting to the quarters is always the aim and still is the aim today. But I think winning the group was significant achievement. Let's not forget that to win that group, it was a Landon Donovan goal, last gasp effort against Algeria to win the game. and win the group. And I think that's a seminal moment. That to me, people say 2002 is the moment that soccer became a thing in America. I think it's 2010. And if you go back on YouTube, there's people that have put together montages of different people in different bars across America. I should remember, I think it was like 11 o'clock Eastern time. It was morning time. Bars are full during the week. Landon Donovan scores this amazing goal that still gives me goosebumps, and people are celebrating across the country. And I remember at the time thinking, okay, the US is a soccer country now. It's taken this long. And I remember after 2010, no one ever again said, you think soccer will make it in America? It was almost as if it had become organic. I think Landon Donovan's goal, despite the fact that Ghana would be this team that was always eliminate the US and the US didn't get to the quarterfinals, yeah, that was a big disappointment. But I think that goal, that Donovan goal, really mattered. I think the team demonstrated this competitive nature that never seen before. And I think overall it reinforced that the US was solid, but maybe not quite elite, right? And that's a question we still ask today. Is this an elite team? And we're always close because US Americans have high standards for sports and we dominate almost at every sport because half of them we invented ourselves. But I think here is where you start to see this idea that maybe the US can go far in the tournament, like a World Cup. But despite what happened, I remember it was a big disappointment losing in the round of 16. But that Donovan goal, I think, still is this top three moment in American soccer history. And I think it's something that matters because I think it signals a shift here by the end of the decade for sure.
By the following year, Bradley would be replaced by former German star Jurgen Klinsmann. What was the general assessment of Bradley's stewardship of the team?
Yeah, thinking back to Bradley, I said he was never great with reporters, and that often does impact your coverage. I will have to say, even as a journalist myself, like the fact that you're not willing to do more interviews or snap back at reporters and argue with them. Reporters don't necessarily love that, and you see that just as a temperament. But I think his tenure was steady. It was effective. I don't think it was spectacular. But I think this is where I mentioned earlier this idea that the U.S. is a gritty team. Now, that grittiness, I think, comes out of less from tactical awareness, but more from having to improvise. Like, hey, we're losing 2-1. We have to do something, or it's 0-0. We need to score a goal, right? But I think he maintained the competitive edge. He achieved some notable successes for sure, like 2009 Confederations Cup. I think that still matters. But I think that critics have pointed out he had tactical limitations. But ultimately, I do think that by the time Klinsmann comes in, the program is moving towards upward trajectory. And the idea of even that someone like Jurgen Klinsmann, who had coached the Germans in 2006, the fact that he would even take the U.S. job showed that the U.S. had maybe not reached the elite level in terms of on the field results, but maybe as in the potential, there was investments being made. And we see that today with Mauricio Pochettino. I mean, the money is being spent. It's a matter of can the results come?
What was the status of the USA national team program as well as that of the MLS at the end of the decade compared to the beginning?
Yeah, by the end of the decade, I would say with the arrival of Beckham, at that point you had more teams. MLS and the national team were both far stronger than they had been a decade earlier. MLS expanded, was stabilized, increased visibility. We should not forget that teams like the Columbus Crew started building soccer-specific stadiums. Attendance was growing. That would become the template for most teams that we see today. The national team had been consistent World Cup appearances, credible performances. I mean, I think the sport was now firmly embedded in the American sporting landscape. The growth of the internet this time also helps. I believe the 2010 World Cup made the tournament totally mainstream to American sports fans like the Olympics would have been. And I mean, the last podcast I was on with you, we are talking about 1986, that World Cup and how foreign soccer was to Americans. By 2010, it was a remarkable shift in a totally different direction to the point where I think even you and I would struggle to really understand how this sport that was very niche, considered very ethnic, very foreign, had become very mainstream. And by 2010, I mean, you would walk around New York City and people would be wearing soccer jerseys. And that's something you never would have seen prior to that.
Also, one thing we should take into account is that Facebook was also part of everyone's life. And I
Right.
think that would have made a difference. I don't think Twitter was still
Early.
about to break big, but Facebook was part of everyone's life at this point. So maybe that had some effect as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Social media plays a big part, streaming of games on the internet, which was still early days here. But these things now put soccer on everyone's radar, and people like you and I would have to wait a week or a month before we can read about soccer. Now we can read about it every day, and it became part of your daily life, and that starts to grow with more and more people for sure. And more kids were playing soccer at this point. That also matters.
Despite the growth of the MLS, was having the European playing experience still the main difference in improvement of the players?
Yeah, I think playing in Europe remained and probably remains to this day a key differentiator, I think, in player development. I mean, it exposed players to higher intensity, tactical sophistication, the best facilities, better competition week to week, which really matters. MLS improved by this point, it has improved, but I think Europe still represented and represents the highest level of soccer. I mean, even the best Brazilian players, the best Argentine players end up in Europe. So this is not a novelty. But I think the combination of both pathways, I think, has helped the US national team grow. The fact that you have a pool of players in Europe, players are also here in the domestic league gives you more options. And I think that really helped the team grow. I mean, let's not forget that the US was always looking for players who were dual citizens to try to get them to become American citizens and to cultivate a national team. This was not happening really at this time. They were getting players because they were developing them. They were born in America. They were growing up with soccer, playing soccer. Some were going to Europe. Many were playing here in the US. And I think that created a larger player pool, which is what you want when you're putting together a national team.
Comparing the beginning of the decade and the end of the decade, what were the stark differences in terms of coverage of the game domestically as well as internationally?
Yeah, by this time, ESPN had really invested a lot of money. I think the 2010 World Cup, ESPN really blew that up, I remember. And let's not forget that Fox Sports was certainly involved in helping grow the game and investing in it. And we see Fox's coverage today. And that was beginning after 2010. That was something that they were also investing in. More games were being broadcast, more European leagues, more international tournaments. I can't overemphasize digital platforms also began to play a role. Soccer goes from being no longer niche, but being steady, mainstream, making Sports Center every night. This is something that is in the ecosystem. MLS is on Fox. So this is something that I think becomes more and more in people's face and they see more and more games. And I think just creating a soccer culture involves having it on TV. Without television, I think at this time, especially, and without the internet, there is no boom that we see today.
How important was the regional rivalry with Mexico in this particular decade? Did the sides push each other in a positive way?
I know you've done a whole podcast on this that I listened to that was very good, but yeah, the rivalry with Mexico is central, I think, to the U.S. growth. The matches were intense, meaningful, these defining moments. Both teams pushed each other to a higher standard, and it's always good to have competition. Competition always makes you better. Iron sharpens iron, they say, right? It has become one of the most established rivalries in international soccer. The series of 2-0 wins known as Dos a Cero against Mexico certainly did help the U.S. establish itself as a regional power. And the idea that the U.S. can beat Mexico, let's say in the Gold Cup final, and the Gold Cup basically is created to have U.S. Mexico meet in the final. Anything short of that is a disappointment for the organizers. So yeah, these two really stand out. But also you have other teams in the region starting to get better too, like Costa Rica and Panama and El Salvador, and that helps the U.S. as well. And then the idea of playing games outside the region that matters too. But yeah, this U.S. Mexico rivalry is amazing, and for many people around the world that don't experience this because they're not really watching CONCACAF, they really should, because I do agree that I think the U.S. Mexico rivalry is one of the best, and it remains that. I fear that that rivalry is starting to water itself down with more teams qualifying for the World Cup. We forget that the qualifiers were always fun because of the hexagonal, and you had X number of teams that had to qualify, and the U.S. had to play Mexico twice every time. And playing at the Azteca during this sort of high pressure qualifier was always something that was fun and always very difficult for the U.S.
If you had to single out a single player for this decade, would Landon Donovan be regarded as the emblematic player of this decade?
Yeah, Landon Donovan has gotten a lot of criticism, I think, at the time. I think maybe less now. He has an autobiography out. He's a broadcaster. I think people see his legacy as much more meaningful. But I do believe Donovan is widely seen as a defining player of this decade, for sure. American player. I covered him during this time. He was very successful in MLS and he did play in England. I mean, I think the knock against him is that he never quite made it abroad, but we should not forget he had some pretty good stints playing in Europe. I think his performances at World Cup level, especially in 2002, where he was named the best youth player, young player at the FIFA at the World Cup then in 2010. I mean, I think it made him a national figure. I think he combined talent, was consistent, big game impact. I mean, I think he had it all. He played with Beckham at the Galaxy. They kind of fed off each other. Even though early days they didn't get along, ultimately a friendship grew from there, and the Galaxy became the best team in MLS in those years. with Bruce Arena as their coach. So a decade later. So yeah, I do think Landon Donovan is the best player this decade, probably one of the best players in U.S. history, modern U.S. history. And I think Christian Pulisic is heir. He is the next impactful player. We'll see what he does this summer. This summer will matter for him because I think it'll either put him above Donovan or below him, depending on what he could achieve with the U.S. But having a World Cup at home, which Donovan never had, is a big opportunity for Pulisic. And maybe Pulisic would benefit a little bit by watching some Landon Donovan tapes because I think Landon Donovan is a pretty fun player. And like I said, just go into YouTube, Donovan, U.S. Algeria 2010 World Cup, and I say no more.
So, in closing, is this perhaps the most critical decade in terms of the status of the game that it is today? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think the year 2000 to 2010, this 10-year period is, I think, arguably the most critical in shaping modern U.S. soccer. I mean, why? Because it transformed the sport from something fragile and into something super stable and growing. You have the structures on the back end, the identity is formed, expectations are established. I think much of today's progress can be traced directly to this period. And the fact that we're doing this talk on this decade on the eve of the 2026 World Cup is sort of, it's important to go back a little bit, even just 20 years to see how far the US has gotten. I do think this decade is really critical. And I think without this decade, without this period of growth, sustained growth, and a domestic league that's growing and a national team that's getting better, you don't have what you have today. I mean, today you have all the players on the US team essentially are play abroad, right? And you have players, American players in Serie A, not one, not two, but more than that. And that's something that you would have been unheard of in the year 2000, for example. So yeah, a sort of a 180-degree shift from the 90s, and I think establishing the roots of where we are today. And I think it's super important. Going into this World Cup, it would benefit a lot of people to go back even just 20 years to see where the US was in 2000. And by 2010, totally different trajectory for the Americans. And I do think in a positive direction. And I think there's no going back now. I do think the US is in this bigger, better, always getting bigger and better year by year, cycle by cycle. And with the exception of 2018, not qualifying, I do think that the US is on an upward swing. And I think it'll only go bigger and better from there.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our contact information and links to your book, again, The World Cup, A History of the Planet's Biggest Sporting Event, is listed, as well as your Substack address are listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Clemente, thank you as always, and I hope to continue these discussions on soccer history.
Same here and enjoy the World Cup.
Thank you. You too.